Today I'm going to talk about my paper that I wrote for my elections class, my final paper, and it is on the presidential election of 1972 between Nixon and George McGovern. George McGovern! No, I can't do an accent very well at all. You're right. I'll stop. Okay, first of all, the name Richard Milhous Nixon. Oh, right? Sends chills up your spine. The first thing you think of is shame, embarrassment, lying, deceit. But you know, before his resignation, before the nation knew that their president was a crook, Nixon won a re-election bid with a record-breaking landslide against George McGovern. The guy, he was reluctant to engage the media and really the country at large, but he still defeated his Democratic opponent by more votes than any president in the history of the United States of America. How did that happen? Here's how. First of all, this was by no means some huge mandate by a predetermined coronation of a wildly successful president. One of the quotes I read was, I think it was from either Newsweek or the New York Times, but it said, few presidents have looked less like a leader than did Richard Nixon as he began the third year of his first term in 1971. Now, keep in mind, Nixon had run in 1968 on the idea that he's going to extricate the United States from the war in Vietnam. 1971, 1972, troops are still dying. We're still in the war. Rampant inflation, unemployment, crime was on the rise. There's a Harris poll taken in April of 1971 that showed Nixon losing 47 to 39, almost 10 points for a sitting president against his presumed rival Edmund Muskie. Among the field of Democrats who might run for this highest office in the land, Senator Muskie was by far the favorite. He had a very experienced staff, endorsements from the heavyweights in the party, and a solid financial backing. His meteoric fall, though, was quick and it was painful. In February, just before the New Hampshire primary, William Loeb, a publisher, published a letter that purported that Muskie had made a racial slur that offended French Canadian Americans, which I didn't even know was a huge constituency, and what he did, he called them Canucks. And I don't think that today, if you called somebody Canucks, that would matter at all. I don't know why it mattered in '72, but apparently it did. So they also spoke of his wife being a drunk, and so there's basically a standoff between him and the press grilling him yelling at the press. Muskie has this emotional outburst that ends in him crying. He's in tears in front of the press. What's crazy, he went on to win the New Hampshire primary, but he's sunk. He's done. In fact, to the point where all of the headlines, even though he won, the headlines read that McGovern almost won, because it was a huge surprise. I mean, McGovern was a relatively unknown senator, okay, but he demonstrated a really sound strategy in the primaries. First of all, McGovern ran on the far left. He interacted with the hippies and the counterculture faction of the Democratic Party, which was still very much there from the 60s. While Muskie used this strategy of spreading his campaign resources around every state, he wanted to, take the nation. McGovern focused on a few very key states and worked long and hard to win each one. The first of which was this New Hampshire, where he spent twice as much time as the frontrunner, pounding on doors, passing out buttons, making his presence be known. And Muskie's campaign deteriorated quickly after New Hampshire. Hubert Humphrey then became the man between McGovern and the nomination. So he keeps this leapfrogging up. The pinnacle of this strategy is in California. The California primary was a winner-take-all primary with 271 delegates at play. Big deal. So McGovern had set up 283 storefront offices, had 500 out-of-state organizers, 10,000 volunteers walking the streets for him in California. He was going all in California. He eventually claimed victory in California and then New York, seemingly clinching the nomination. But when the Democratic Party gathered for its convention in Miami, George McGovern, this deft campaigner who had risen to the top of his ticket, seemed to have absolutely no control over the proceedings. First of all, Humphrey challenged California's winner-take-all delegate selection procedure, and it just cost him time. McGovern eventually won that debate, but it cost him time through the parliamentary maneuverings. The New York delegation then, on the last night of the convention, held up the floor for hours over some minute point that absolutely mattered to no one, really, except for the New York delegation. And that meant the delay meant that McGovern would now deliver his acceptance speech at 2:30 in the morning. 2:30 in the morning. This is how he announced who was going to be vice president, at 2:30 in the morning. Nobody even knew. Years later, George McGovern said that he thought that was the most costly mistake in his campaign, letting the prime time speech get away from him. He said he stumbled on the very first hurdle. Now, here's where it gets fun. Immediately after the convention, the McGovern campaign shaken by scandal. McGovern had named this guy named Tom Eagleton as his vice president after having only met the man twice, one of which was for 45 minutes in the Senate steam bathroom. Soon, the campaign discovered that Eagleton had been hospitalized 3 times and had even received electroshock treatment for a nervous disorder. So, in an attempt to preempt any attacks about the Eagleton affair, as it became to be known, McGovern held a press conference explaining the vice presidential candidate's past problems. McGovern told the press that these issues were no longer important and he stands behind Eagleton 1,000%. Pretty good move, right? Well, McGovern advisors keep pounding him, saying, you got to get rid of this guy. It's not going to help. And eventually the press says the same thing. McGovern gives in to the pressure and drops Eagleton from the ticket. He considered this a huge mistake, and the campaign would never regain momentum. He said, I just couldn't get it back on track. It was a major stumble. He looks ineffective. His choices of who he surrounds himself with are now in doubt. And McGovern looks indecisive time and time again. McGovern, he denies allegations during the general election of sending an agent to campaign an agent of the campaign to negotiate with North Korea. Hours later, he confirmed, oh yeah, no, I actually did do that, which you probably shouldn't have done. Anyway, and one pillar of his primary campaign was a promise of $1,000 to every single citizen, regardless of who you are. Now, during the general election, he starts getting grilled on this, and he's, oh, no, I never said that. So he just looks like a waffler, a flip-flopper. John Kerry wasn't the first. So President Nixon, one of the most reclusive presidents in history, he didn't feel like he needed a campaign at all. In fact, Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, says, and I quote, he doesn't have to campaign. He doesn't have to establish his identity. He's been exposed for 25 years. So instead of the usual whistle-stop campaigning, Nixon just used the office of the presidency to show voters his effectiveness on foreign policy. In 1972, Richard Nixon had only given 7 press conferences. This doesn't mean that he ignored television, though, or the press. He learned to use the medium masterfully by making himself look like a very effective leader. Nixon made that historic trip to China in early 1972. He made sure those cameras were watching, and just days before the election, on October 26th, Henry Kissinger returned from negotiations with North Vietnam to give a speech from the White House stating that peace is at hand. It's really hard for McGovern to run on an anti-war campaign when Kissinger's out there saying that peace is at hand. Although the Nixon campaign didn't campaign actively, we all know that there was a campaign. I mean, in fact, the Committee to Re-elect the President, otherwise known as CREEP, they really called it that, raised more money than any presidential campaign in history, and the machinery behind CREEP was massive, establishing 2,000 storefronts across the nation, and they weren't merely there to show presence. There were intense canvassing machines. In fact, there were 2 levels to the Nixon campaign. The critically important level was the White House level, showing his leadership. And then there was the second, or CREEP level, of manipulation, organization, and mobilization of votes. McGovern he still tried to fight back. He aired negative campaign ads blaming the president for a crime rate that had risen 30% since he took office. And of course, he tried to attach the president to the bugging of the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. But, McGovern claimed that the Nixon administration was the most corrupt in the history of American government. But charges of corruption fell on deaf ears. I mean, McGovern had already been marginalized by his own effectiveness. Whatever he said was discounted as hysterical moralizing. Charges on his lips seemed not fashioned by facts, but by hyperbole. In November, Nixon landed 60.7% of the popular vote, with McGovern only winning 17 electoral votes, that of he won Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. For the first time since the New Deal, a Democrat had lost support of labor unions and Catholics. McGovern, the man who came from nowhere and who played the polls in the primary like a piano, had been defeated by Nixon, the man who seemed not to even campaign at all. The president simply looked like a leader and allowed the Democrats to destroy themselves. So that is Nixon versus McGovern, at least from a basic campaign point of view. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll have some more later. I've got other cool stuff to do. So thanks for watching. Appreciate you.